where we see it so that we could then conceive of design, as he puts it, as the play between the notion of a situation as it develops and takes shape before our eyes and as an ensemble of relation and patterns of forces, and our understanding of the potential which is implied by that situation and can be made to play on stage. I want to really emphasize that quotation. As I talk, for example, with the trans-design students, the second years, about their thesis, this notion of having to grasp the ensemble of relations and the patterns of forces involved in a situation, and at the same time be able to see the potential in that situation is completely key. Now, let's look also, though, at the second concept which I brought out. Innovation, I said, especially in relationship to Beck, requires courage. Beck, our unemployed electrical draftsman, was able to do what professional cartographers and graphic designers were unable to do because he had the courage to deploy his own resources in dealing with a discrepancy in the existing paradigm. Now let's just think this idea of the kind of the courage that he had to do this. Courage is not simply bravery in any simple sense. In a very lovely small piece of writing, which I will probably send to you, Alain Badier talks in the prologue of his book, Metapolitics, about the French resistance during World War II and the relationship between logic, thought, and some philosophers in France who joined the resistance. His point is that for many who actively resisted the Nazis, resistance was not an ethical or even political decision per se, certainly not, as Badier says, a sociological decision. It was, he said, a kind of logical move. And I think this is worth thinking about. He says that resistance happened in many cases because it was based upon people telling themselves what the situation was and then taking on board the consequent implications for acting, what Badier calls the foundation of a practical possibility that flowed from that flowed from telling oneself what the situation was. And this leads Badier into two very interesting insights about change and transformation. The first is about those who did not resist. Well, they both insights are about people who did not resist. Those who did not resist, by contrast, he said, if we leave aside the clique of conscious collaborators, were quite simply those who did not want to tell the situation like it was, not even to themselves. It is no exaggeration to say that they did not think. What I mean by this is that they did not think according to the real of the situation at the moment in question, that they rejected the fact that this real was for them personally the bearer of the possibility of action. The first quote. The second talks about risk. Unlike what is often upheld, this does not amount to believing that it is the risk, very serious indeed, which prevents a good many from resisting. Now, Badier does not underestimate the actual risk of people's lives at all. He points out that, in fact, most of the philosophers who joined the Renaissance, the resistance, were in fact shot. So he's not underestimated risk. But he's saying that it's not the risk that really stops people. It is, on the contrary, the non-thinking of the situation that prevents the risk or the examination of possibles. Not to resist is not to think is not to risk. Risking. Now this links, if you think about it, with something, another quotation I've given previously, which is from Gillian Rose, who says that politics, i.e. design, does not happen when you act on the behalf of your own damaged good, but when you act without guarantee for the good of all. This is to take the risk of universal interest. Badier ends his small excursus with a last paragraph, which I'll read to you. These philosophers and a great many others, who were by no means philosophers, only thought it important to tell the situation like it was, and therefore to risk that there were risks. And there are always a good many, great or small, when thought opens a Every time thought opens up possibles, there are risks. That is why today, when the consensus held in such high esteem is the non-thinking politics of no alternatives, and when thinking the real of the situation is rare, then we turn with gratitude towards these figures, he says, as providing models for us. One model, which I happen to know almost by accident, because I was in a hotel one day and got nothing to read, picked up this book for $10,000, which was a story about the spy network that the Allies and the French resistance created along the coast of France in 1943-1944, trying to measure the German defenses for the Atlantic War. The book is an absolutely extraordinary account, not only of the sheer bravery of people who did that, but their remarkable inventiveness in how they actually mapped this in very difficult situation. This young man who made his bicycle completely sort of demountable in order that he could wrap up the blueprints and slide them inside the bicycle frame. Or the elderly blind man that the Germans happily let walk by the sea, elderly and blind, and who took with him a 12-year-old boy, and carefully between them, the old man and the boy counted out the number of steps and learned to pace exactly, counted very precisely the number of steps as they were going east and then north, able to make absolutely precise maps of the situation. Extraordinary effectiveness, extraordinary courage. Conversely to this, what Badier's sentences throw up here is the relationship between conventional repetition of what is and the manner in which it is the non-thinking of the situation that prevents risk or an examination of possible. So the wider point here is this relation between telling it like it is, accepting the risk of the consequence of acting, and that in turn provoking both a courage to act and a kind of inventiveness, or the inventive spirit, we might say. And I would persuade you to read, I won't go into the section in detail, but I would persuade you to read pages 15, particularly 15 to 17 in Clay Shirley's article, where he talks about the formation of this website in Kenya in 2008, which came from an informal network of reporting violence. It is a very beautiful example of one's invention in observation and resistance. Now, as we're going through this process of kind of thinking about this mix of sort of innovation and of understanding the courage to innovate, what we're actually kind of coming very close to saying is that the essence of critical work in design is really thinking the situation. This was the point as I took it in Constantine's lecture, this quotation from George Perec here, who was asking us to question even those moments of the everyday. Also George. Now also, there's examples. Small ways, almost insignificant in their own way, but both of them also reminding us in some ways that the very notion of critical design has had to emerge, capitalized, if you like, critical design, as a response to the forgetting by conventional designing that all design begins in a critical moment. Remember Herbert Simon's basic definition that designing is devising courses of action to change existing situations into preferred. In order to have that difference between existing and preferred situations, that is, in effect, a a critique of the existing situation. Simon represses that notion in a kind of technological manner. He kind of pushes it to one side. It doesn't acknowledge, I don't think anywhere in his book, is this critical structure in design. Yet it's actually there, it's deep inside the situation. So in fact, every design as an activity is dependent then on this notion of critique. But it's also dependent, and this is the other side of design, upon a process of discovery. That's really what George Nelson was on about. Thinking the situation such that it becomes a moment of discovery. One looks and discovers other possibilities. We can actually even say that critical work in effect sort of is simply the placing of other possibilities against existing reality and thinking the implications of that. Now this can sound trite, but it's not. And the Czech novelist Milan Kundera explains why. In a lovely couple of sentences in his little book, The Art of the Novel, he actually gets a sort of Occam's razor of ethics. He says this: the sole raison d'etre of a novel is to explore the realm of human possibilities. Everything we can become, everything we're capable of, novelists draw up the map of existence by discovering this or that human possibility. And then the key sentence: a novel that does not discover a hitherto unknown or unregarded thought segment of existence is immoral. Fantastic. Completely splits novel. If you don't discover anything, you're just an entertainment novel. Right. If you discover, that is the novel's power. Now, Kundera's assumption is that we do not know in advance what the possibilities of human life are. The task of art and culture in general, therefore, is not just a recounting of existence or already known states of being, but their investigation and exploration. Now, a novel is not design, of course, but we might say that if the realm of the novel is the exploration of subjective existence, what are the subjects, relationships, emotions, so on and so forth, the trajectories of lives, then we could say that the realm of design is something like the exploration of subjective existence through the mediation of things. But another way, it's the discovery of what things can be for us in their mediation. Now, I put the deliberate emphasis on the subjective there because I think in the end, as we know, design really is an exploration not really of things, but of ourselves, or particularly of ourselves in relationship to things, the necessary relationship we have to things. Design, we could say, takes on the self-appointed task of reflectively examining the possibilities of this relation. It has to take on this task because nobody else does. There is nobody else who looks at the relation between subjects and things. Perhaps by looking again at the overlooked, I'm thinking of Constantine and souvenirs, or by asking what it is that a thing might become. Now, what is interesting here is how design does this at best, often by touching upon small things, but nonetheless open very large emotions. There's a lovely example of that in the reading that Constantine gave from his own piece of writing about souvenirs, where he says this. Let me read you the story just in a paragraph. Once in New York, I visited the apartment of two elderly Holocaust survivors. They met in Europe shortly after the liberation and soon got married, but could not conceive a child, health being seriously damaged after years in the camp. One day the man gave his wife a small toy bear, a touching souvenir of the family they were never to have. Collecting and giving each other bears has become their lifelong tradition. Eventually their spacious apartment became home to over 1,000 bears of every conceivable material, size and look. These are not functional, useful objects, and most of them have little or no artistic value. Yet how is it possible not to take this collection seriously, not to treat it with proper affection and respect? An example in the from earlier in the course of this notion of small things that open upon large issues was Adorno's insight made under the heading "Technology is making gestures precise and brutal, and with them men." That was the opening sentence to that little paragraph by Adorno on technology, when he said that the new human type cannot be properly understood, even in its most secret innovations, without awareness of what is continuously exposed to the world of things around it. And Adorno gave the famous example in his piece where he said, which driver is not tempted merely by the power of his engine to wipe out the vermin of the street, pedestrians, children, and cyclists? Although significantly too, Adorno gave just as much weight in that paragraph, if you remember, to the very simplest of things, to those things that exist almost below the threshold of mind and consciousness. He says, let me just read it to you. Thus, the ability is lost, for example, to close a door quietly and discreetly yet firmly. Those of cars and refrigerators have to be slammed, others have the tendency to snap shut by themselves, imposing on those entering the bad manners and not looking behind them, not shielding the interior of the house, which receives them here. What's important in Adorno's perception is not the apparent triviality of the thing itself, that which is we will never, almost never actually actively reflect on, but how in mentioning these, as it were, Adorno is actually bringing us something very close to what Janon Lanier, at the beginning of the course, also pointed at, the way that technology acts below consciousness, below reflective consciousness, so that we are determined by things more than we know. But then we've also saw the enigmatic quality of insignificant things, both in the Berlin lecture and in Elaine Sky's text from the Body of Pain. In the Berlin lecture, it was the enigmatic, the sudden, the simplest of things. Here, an envelope which disclosed a message from a woman on the night before she was deported. Numerous examples of that. And in different ways, both Scary and the Berlin Memorial offered a series of discoveries about the work of things. Scary's proposition that achieving an understanding of political justice may require that we first arrive at an understanding of making and unmaking was based on a double understanding of how the human being is both made and unmade by things, or more precisely, how the human being is made through things and unmade through the deprivation of things. Two quotations from Scary about making us. And they're amazing in a way because each one is counterfactual to our norms. Anonymous mass-produced objects, she says, contain a collective and equally extraordinary message. Whoever you are, and whether or not I personally like or even know you, at least in this small way, be well. The second proposition was, the general distribution of material objects to a population means that a certain minimum level of objectified human compassion is built into the revised structure of the external world. And this compassion does not depend then on the generosity of other inhabitants, which itself cannot be legislated. That last quote is poignant in relationship, of course, to the Berlin Memorial, because the whole process that memorial referred to was the precise opposite of that. The actual deprivation of a population from material objects as part of preparation, as part of their deconstruction, and as preparation for their ultimate destruction. It was this deprivation that we saw emblematized so powerfully in the Berlin Memorial. The message here is that which makes us can also in its withdrawal unmake us, can turn us into non-persons, can make us literally into those who can be removed from the world without compunction, guilt, or disquiet. We could say that it's that last point that is the real and true evil of the Heidegger's terrible line in his essay called Overcoming Metaphysics, where he says, even the immense suffering which surrounds the world is unable to awaken a transformation. I mean, collective, shall we say. Now that Steenschnock hit upon this point, what I will call that something like the political agency of separation or degradation in their memorial, shows that they created something in Berlin which was not simply a passive object, but an active simulation of the situation that we're doing addressing. Now I want to think about this idea of situation and simulation, because I think it's extremely important. I think this is where we go, we're able to move from, to take design one stage further. We've encountered simulations before. The point was made in reference to the LUD that it's not just a map of the system, but it allows us to practice our capabilities to travel, even as we see here from a very young age. It allows what we would technically call scenario modeling. And it can do this, we said, because it offers a simulation of the system of work, which means it doesn't just offer an iconic model of the network, which it does, but rather the LUD combines this with a simulation of how travelers actually work the system, the kind of game that travelers play in an underground system, where they start to finish journeys at stations, can't recognize the name of the stations they go through, change from one line to another at certain points. This mental game that we play is actually, can be played again according to essentially similar rules within the London Underground diagram. So as Penrice says, diagram and the traveller together constitute a kind of working model of the railway, not a static representation. So there is a kind of there is a process of simulation here. Now this works because Beck gives a highly selective representation of the system. It's this which actually, this abstraction which allows us to model the system. But at the same time, because it is a real simulation of how we travel through time, we can say that simulation is a kind of realism. It is that which ties the speculative object to the real, and it's that tie that makes the work have consequences for mind, for how we conceive of what we do. Just to come back to Berlin for a second. What gives this work its force is how through the design choreography that we encountered, is that it creates a kind of simulation of what transpired in Berlin between 1933 and 1942. But it does so not in a museum, but in the context of everyday life. So in the memorial as we experience it, two temporalities meet. Those of now, the time of what is, the time of normal recurrence, the time of everyday life, and the time of an extraordinary eventual time, the time of a genocide. And these things lie together in this memorial. The regulation lies next to the flabby window box. And these times are all the more peculiarly entwined, because the eventual time referred to is itself both extraordinary and 9-year campaigns to the preparation for extermination, and absolutely quotidian, the very stuff of everyday life. And at the same time, the simulation, which itself acts something like a kind of a game site. We visited the site, we enter a quest, to some extent we enter a labyrinth and try to discover its nature. At the same time, this acts too as in exactly the same way that Badiou said events, that is to say, thought events, work. So the Berlin Memorial, we might say, situates itself within its locale, but it's at the same time detached from the rules of the situation. It speaks to the existing situation to now, but at the same moment launches thought beyond the So it's an uncanny object. It is in and beyond what is now. But then this is what critical objects, critical simulations actually do. In the Berlin Memorial, the space of the event when we grasp these regulations is sharp and momentous, for we know what is coming, even to the children denied players in the site for hopscotch. Yet we look around the context of this site, just off the Bayerischer Platz, and see the children playing in the school playground. So the situation is both real and uncanny, fact and theatre, but has a kind of direct realism, which, for example, the allegorical expressions of, say, Liebstin just doesn't have. It's impossible almost for you to tell which of this pair of slides, the left or the right, actually comes from the Jewish Museum in Berlin, and which one comes from the Denver Art Museum. They're essentially the same. They're simply, one is an allegory of suffering, supposed to be, one is an allegory of art. By contrast, in the Berlin Memorial, we seem to be down to what is fundamental in life, to its kind of material moments, which are here reenacted even in the most traumatic of circumstances. And it's just this, of course, that allows us to grasp the content open here. Because I want to talk about, just for a second, about this project and the way that it opens up, the way that this simulation creates knowledge, new knowledge. Now, one of the things that when we think about simulations, particularly in science, let us think about simulations of whatever pattern. We assume that we are creating that simulation from known knowledge, and the simulation is in effect a kind of application of that known knowledge. There's a question, therefore, whether the simulation can itself actually produce the knowledge. Now, what we have here is a presentation of laws, fact, knowledge, already existing historical knowledge. Yet we're instantly aware that the presentation of this knowledge is completely different in this setting than it would be, say, in a museum, or say, if we read it in a textbook. And do we have new knowledge here? Well, perhaps not exactly new knowledge, but we have something very close to new understanding. What the total memorial does, I think, is to create a new idiom of understanding about how the Holocaust operated. I can give you 5 points, for example. One, once we experience this memorial, our attention goes much less from the idea of simply the Holocaust as death to the questions of what made it possible to murder as a culture. What made that participation possible? We start to ask ourselves about the process, not simply the fact of it. Secondly, and I think I said this in the lecture, that the memorial acts as a kind of measure. What is immeasurable and too vast to grasp, really, which is why we abstract it or turn it into myth, now becomes measured. It has a, if you like, substantive reality, and that is massively helped by the fact that here we are dealing with concrete, simple human things. So thirdly, we go from the sort of mythic abstraction towards seeing the Holocaust as a political sequence. We see that the real banality of the Holocaust is in that sequence. Fourthly, we get a subtle shift of Nazi politics. We even see that Nazi politics were extraordinarily subtle, as well as being extraordinarily unsubtle. That in fact the whole political process of... We'll see something close to this taken up in Mary Flanagan next week, a view of radical game design and its subversive, disruptive and interventionist policies is not far off this kind of understanding here. By necessity, the notion of simulacrum and simulation will arise in her talk as well. Games are by necessity related to simulation, even if they take off towards the degrees of autonomy that design, strictly speaking, cannot aspire to. Precisely by being held to the real world that is capable of acting in the world. But simulation comes into play acutely not only in representation but in enactment and the envisaging of other kinds of material and social relations, other possibilities of existence. Here I'm particularly interested in the notion of simulation and the opening of, or closing of relations. And I can end this lecture in the way I ended the previous one by looking at this redesign of the birth center by Barbara Marx, a project which is in some ways appears almost inconsequential until you begin to very carefully think about what's actually involved here. And I would refer you here, I won't go through it in detail now, but I would refer you here to the few pages from Stephen video I gave you, which although it sounds like a very improbable reading for the designers from an English social historian in the 1970s, what it nonetheless does is try to talk about the relationship between the material forms and social relations. So have a look what's actually kind of doing here. Let's try one. We presented here with two alternatives. Two models of giving birth, a hospital and a birthing center. Now the significance of this shift isn't just in the configuration per se, it's actually in the relations that each imply. Let's think of the conventional hospital, the layout. I could think of 6 major implications which are left of that layout. The first and prime one is that the woman giving birth is treated as a patient, as actually suffering from a medical condition. The second one would be that birth is a medical procedure and can be most easily dealt with as a medical procedure by surgery, hence the enormous growing popularity of cesarean sections. Thirdly, given 1 and 2, the woman is passive, no control. The woman is, and in fact, why is surgery so popular? Because you're sedated. You are literally an object of experiment. Fourthly, husband and family are excluded from the process till it's all over. Fifthly, there's a kind of in and out procedure here, a sort of, but there's also a hospital stay, and this can be very profitable, as can surgery. It is profitable. Sixthly, this is very much in the hands of the doctors. Midwives are excluded, the women who traditionally, six factors. Comparison, the birthing suite. Woman here, in Barbara Marx's model. The woman is not a patient, she is herself, if you read the Harris's article. The birth is a natural procedure. It's not surgical except in cases of emergency. The woman is active. She's in control of the process. Husband, family are included. Children can be there. There is no hospital stay. There is rest. And the whole thing is largely organized by midwives, not by doctors. This is a complete contrast. But the contrasts go deeper than this. Let me tell you the experience, fundamental to me, very fundamental, of actually being present at my son's birth and the difference that it made. I was there in the process of birth. It was tense. It was 30 or 40 seconds when we shoot a lot longer. It was an absolute issue. Moment of panic amongst you could tell amongst the medics. It wasn't just me. molding, to become a brilliant professor, a magnificent artist, a great cricketer and play for Yorkshire, and be a brilliant footballer and play for Liverpool Football Club, and be a superb left-wing politician, and be a great novelist, all the things I have not been. At that moment, bang, out the window. That split second was the understanding that he was, and that all that I could therefore do in the rest of his life was sort of beg, try not to disaster, but more than that, one could not measure. By comparison, 3 or 4 hours later, when I see him in the incubator, passive little object, all my fantasy started, father-like fantasy started. Now that actually gave me the realization of the complete and utter difference, the qualitative difference of total experience, which is enabled or not. This happens to be a very progressive hospital with that. So we're not trying to, you can see that we're not trying to tar every hospital with the same brush. But you can see the point here that what we're actually dealing with sometimes in these simple configuration questions is not just questions of architecture. They actually play upon questions of behavior right down to extreme subtlety of how we can be as human beings. And so somehow when we are designing the future, this sense has somehow to be fulfilled. Okay, enough that story. Thank you.